Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Gerald thought he knew his wife better than anyone else. 15 years of marriage should have meant something, should have built a solid foundation of trust and closeness. But on that October night, as he watched Olivia put away her champagne flute with mechanical, precise movements, he realized he might never have truly known her at all. The house was decorated with white flowers, her favorite, and the scent of grilled salmon still lingered in the kitchen. Gerald had spent hours preparing this surprise, wanting to celebrate the achievement they'd both worked toward for years. Olivia's judicial appointment was the crowning moment of a shared effort, or at least that's what he believed. They'd met in college, when Gerald was studying accounting and Olivia was in her second year of law school. She was determined, focused, with that unmistakable spark in her eyes of someone who knew exactly where she was headed. Gerald fell in love with that ambition, with that certainty. They married 2 years later in a simple ceremony with close friends and family. Shortly afterward, Gerald opened his own accounting consultancy, steadily building a reliable client base in Columbus, Ohio. The business grew slowly but consistently, allowing Olivia to dedicate herself fully to her legal career without immediate financial worries. When Sophie was born 12 years ago, Gerald adjusted his routine to be present, taking their daughter to school, attending parent-teacher meetings, organizing study afternoons while Olivia worked on increasingly complex cases. Olivia's legal career was impressive. She started with family law, representing clients in complicated divorces and custody battles. Gerald always admired how she handled those cases, with a professional detachment that contrasted sharply with the warm woman he knew at home. Or the woman he thought he knew. Over time, Olivia began networking politically, attending charity dinners, party events, constantly expanding her circle of contacts. Gerald supported all of it, proud to see his wife rise. When she expressed interest in seeking a state judicial appointment, he encouraged her wholeheartedly, taking on even more household responsibilities so she could focus on the quiet, behind-the-scenes campaigning those processes required. The past 2 years had been especially intense. Olivia traveled frequently for legal conferences, political meetings, and networking events. Gerald filled in during her absences with Sophie, explaining to their daughter that Mom was building something important for all of them. Sophie, a sensitive, intelligent girl, accepted this maturely, though Gerald noticed she missed her mother at school performances, volleyball games, and the everyday moments Olivia increasingly missed. The official confirmation of the appointment arrived on a rainy Thursday. Gerald got Olivia's call in the middle of the afternoon, her voice vibrating with restrained satisfaction. He immediately began planning the celebration. He sent his staff home early, stopped by the market, bought the flowers, the French champagne they saved for special occasions. He carefully prepared dinner, played soft music, set the dining room table with the candles they rarely used. Sophie was staying at her maternal grandmother's house, as Olivia had requested earlier that day, saying she wanted a private moment with Gerald to celebrate. Olivia arrived around 9 that night, later than planned, but with that radiant smile Gerald hadn't seen in months. She wore the navy blue suit he'd always said looked perfect on her and carried a leather briefcase that seemed heavier than it should have been. They ate dinner talking about the details of the appointment, the next steps, what the swearing-in ceremony would be like. Gerald watched her face lit by candlelight and felt a deep satisfaction at having been part of this journey. It was while they were putting away the glasses, side by side in the kitchen, that Olivia's tone shifted. Her voice grew serious, controlled, almost professional. She said they needed to talk about their future, about their marriage. Gerald turned to her, still smiling, thinking she'd mention plans, maybe that vacation they'd kept postponing, or perhaps renovating the house now that they'd have more financial stability. But the words that came out of Olivia's mouth hit him like a series of precise punches to the gut. She wanted to separate. She said it with a disturbing calm, as if presenting a motion in court. Gerald's legs went weak, he leaned against the kitchen counter, struggling to process what he was hearing. Olivia kept talking, explaining she'd thought it over carefully, that she felt they'd grown in different directions, that she no longer felt connected to him in the way marriage required. She said, and these words were seared into Gerald's memory like scars, that he was a good man, an excellent father, but that she needed to move forward now that she'd achieved professional independence. Gerald tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Olivia already had everything planned. She mentioned lawyers, asset division, custody arrangements. She'd rehearsed this, that much was clear. Every sentence was measured, calculated, like the final verdict in a case already decided. When Gerald finally managed to ask if there was someone else, Olivia hesitated for just a fraction of a second before replying it wasn't about another person, it was about herself, about what she needed to feel fulfilled. For the next 3 days, Gerald ran on autopilot. He went to the office, met with clients, reviewed spreadsheets, but his mind remained stuck in that kitchen, in that moment when everything collapsed. Olivia had temporarily moved into a downtown apartment, saying she needed space. Sophie returned home confused and frightened, and Gerald had to explain to his daughter, heartbroken, that Mom and he were going through a tough time. Sophie cried in his arms, asking if it was her fault, and Gerald assured her it wasn't, never would be, though he himself didn't understand what had happened. But something deeply troubled Gerald. The way Olivia had handled that conversation, the coldness, the obvious preparation. And there were small details that began piling up in his mind. In recent months, Olivia had worn jewelry he didn't remember seeing before. That night of the celebration, she'd been wearing a delicate gold necklace that definitely hadn't come from him. There were also the frequent trips, always justified as conferences and professional events, but Gerald started wondering if they'd really been just that. On the morning of the 4th day after the divorce announcement, while drinking coffee alone in the kitchen, Gerald received an unexpected visitor. It was Tom, the neighbor who lived 3 houses down, a retired man who spent his days tending his garden and watching the street. Tom looked uneasy, twisting a baseball cap in his hands as he spoke. He said he'd noticed Gerald and Sophie alone the past few days and had heard through the neighborhood about the separation. Then, with the look of someone carrying a heavy burden, Tom revealed something that made Gerald's blood run cold. For the past 6 months, maybe longer, Tom had seen Olivia leaving the house at odd hours, especially when Gerald was away on business trips. On at least 3 occasions, he'd watched her get into the car of a man who picked her up at the corner, the same sleek black car every time. Tom apologized for not speaking up sooner, saying he didn't want to interfere, but now that he knew about the separation, he felt Gerald deserved to know. He also mentioned seeing Olivia and the same man enter the Hampton Inn together, the most discreet hotel in the area, just 15 minutes from their home. Gerald thanked Tom in a voice he barely recognized as his own. When the neighbor left, he stood in the living room, feeling a mix of nausea and absolute clarity. It all made sense now, the emotional distance Olivia had shown in recent months, the trips, the expensive gifts she claimed were from grateful colleagues, the rush to finalize the divorce right after the appointment was confirmed. She wasn't just leaving the marriage, she'd already left it long ago, and someone was waiting on the other side. Gerald wasn't the impulsive type. His profession demanded patience, meticulous analysis, attention to detail. But in that moment, something in him changed. He needed to know the full truth, and he needed to know it immediately. He picked up the phone and called Jake, a private investigator who'd done work for some of his clients in corporate fraud cases. Jake was discreet, efficient, and promised quick results. While he waited, Gerald began his own investigation. Olivia had always been careful, but also overly confident in her own intelligence. She'd left her old laptop at home when she moved out, taking only the new one provided by the court after her appointment. Gerald turned on the old device, and although Olivia had deleted many files, the automatic cloud backup was still synced. He spent hours sifting through old emails, documents, browsing history. What he found was devastating. Messages exchanged with a man named Charles Whitmore, an influential corporate lawyer from Cleveland whom Gerald vaguely recognized from social events. The earliest messages dated back nearly 18 months, initially professional, discussing cases and legal strategies. But the tone quickly shifted, becoming personal, then intimate, then explicit. Olivia and Charles had first met at a legal seminar in Cincinnati, and from there, their relationship developed rapidly. The messages revealed hotel rendezvous, weekends when both claimed to be at conferences, plans for the future. Charles promised political support for Olivia's judicial appointment, mentioning contacts he could leverage and influence he could exert. There were also references to his own marriage, but Charles assured Olivia it was only a matter of time before he divorced too, that they'd be together as soon as circumstances allowed. What shocked Gerald most was a specific message Olivia had sent Charles 3 months earlier, in which she wrote outright that once the appointment was confirmed, she would end her marriage to Gerald. She wrote that he'd been useful, that she couldn't have reached where she was without his financial and emotional support, but that now it was time to move forward with someone on her same professional level. Charles replied with a heart emoji and a promise that once they were both free, he'd introduce her to the highest circles of the state judiciary, that she'd be a superior court judge within 5 years. Gerald felt a cold, controlled anger take hold of him. It wasn't just the personal betrayal, though that was painful enough. It was the calculated manipulation, the cynical use of him as a stepping stone, the cruelty of it all having been planned so far in advance. He saved all the messages, took screenshots, organized everything into dated, categorized folders. His accountant's mind automatically worked to build a solid, irrefutable case. Jake called that evening with his preliminary report. In less than 48 hours, he'd obtained photos of Olivia and Charles entering and leaving the Hampton Inn on 4 different occasions over the past 2 months. He also had records of frequent, lengthy phone calls between them, often late at night. Jake added that Charles Whitmore had been married for 23 years to a woman named Patricia Whitmore, who happened to be a public prosecutor in the neighboring county, known for being relentless and having zero tolerance for ethical scandals. Gerald thanked Jake and asked him to send everything via encrypted email. Then, with a clarity that surprised him, he began planning his next move. It wasn't about revenge, at least not in the destructive sense. It was about justice, about ensuring that people who used and manipulated others faced consequences, about protecting his daughter and his own dignity. And it was about doing it all intelligently, without emotional outbursts or violence, just by presenting the truth to the right people at the right time. That same night, Gerald sent an email to Patricia Whitmore. He was direct and factual, introducing himself, explaining the situation, attaching the evidence he'd gathered. He wasn't melodramatic or accusatory, he simply laid out the facts as they were. He also sent a copy to the Ethics Board of the State Bar Association, focusing on Charles's mentions of using political influence to benefit Olivia's appointment, which could constitute unethical conduct. Finally, he sent a similar package to the editor of a local newspaper known for covering scandals involving public figures, especially judges and prominent attorneys. Then Gerald called Olivia and asked her to come over that night to talk. He said they needed to sort out practical matters regarding Sophie and that it would be better to do it in person. Olivia agreed, sounding relieved that he was being reasonable. She arrived around 8, as confident as ever. Sophie was again at her grandmother's, and the house was quiet. Gerald greeted her in the living room, where he'd arranged the coffee table with neatly printed copies of all the evidence he'd collected, messages, photos, the investigators' reports, everything laid out clearly and chronologically. Olivia walked in and immediately her eyes went to the documents on the table. Gerald watched the color drain from her face, her confidence evaporating instantly. She tried to speak, but he raised a hand for silence. "I thought I deserved a real explanation," Gerald began, his voice calm but charged with an intensity she'd never heard before. "You told me it wasn't about someone else, that it was about you finding fulfillment. But this," he pointed to the evidence, "tells me a very different story." Olivia tried to approach the table, but Gerald blocked her path. "Charles Whitmore. An 18-month affair. Hotel meetings while I was taking care of our daughter and paying our bills. And best of all, you timed the divorce to coincide exactly with your appointment. Classic use of available resources until they're no longer needed. Gerald, I can explain, Olivia started, but her voice trembled, the eloquent lawyer replaced by someone clearly panicking. No need, Gerald interrupted. It's all very clear here. You used our marriage as a stable base while building your career and your secret relationship. And Charles used political influence to help your appointment, which, I'm sure you know, raises serious ethical questions. Olivia tried to downplay it, saying the messages were taken out of context, that Charles was just a professional friend who supported her, that Gerald was misinterpreting everything. But as she spoke, Gerald could see in her eyes that she knew he had too much proof, that there was no way out of this conversation with her version of the story intact. Do you know who Patricia Whitmore is? Gerald asked abruptly, changing the subject. Olivia blinked, confused by the question. She's Charles's wife. A public prosecutor. Highly respected. And now she knows everything. So does the State Bar Ethics Board. And the local newspaper that loves stories like this. All the blood drained from Olivia's face. She staggered slightly, leaning on the sofa. You didn't do that, she whispered. Gerald, you couldn't have done that. This will destroy my career, my reputation. You destroyed our family, Gerald replied, and for the first time his voice carried real emotion, a deep pain he could no longer hide. You used 15 years of my life as a means to an end. You betrayed not just me, but Sophie, who adores you and doesn't understand why her mother suddenly has no time for her anymore. You made choices, Olivia. And choices have consequences. Olivia tried to negotiate then. She offered to accept a more favorable asset division for Gerald, promised to let him have primary custody of Sophie, begged him to undo what he'd done. But Gerald had already made his decision. He told her the divorce would now proceed on his terms, he would seek full custody of Sophie based on emotional abandonment and the instability her scandal would bring, and that he had no interest in protecting her reputation when she'd shown no interest in protecting their family. Olivia left that house that night completely shattered, nothing like the confident woman who'd announced the divorce just days earlier. Gerald stayed alone in the living room, staring at the evidence spread across the table, feeling a mix of sadness and resolve. He took no pleasure in it, but he knew he'd done what was necessary. In the days that followed, the story exploded. The newspaper published a detailed article about the newly appointed judge and her affair with a married, influential attorney, raising questions about judicial ethics and possible improper influence in the appointment process. Patricia Whitmore filed a highly public and devastating divorce against Charles, who quickly found himself losing major clients and facing an investigation by the Bar Association. The Judicial Ethics Board opened a formal inquiry into Olivia, focusing on allegations that she'd benefited from improper political influence in her appointment. Olivia tried to defend herself publicly, claiming her relationship with Charles had only begun after their separation, but the dated evidence contradicted her version. Her carefully built reputation crumbled within weeks. Technically, she kept her judgeship, since no direct corruption was proven, but everyone knew the story, and she became an isolated figure in the judiciary, avoided by colleagues who didn't want to be associated with the scandal. The divorce was quick and settled exactly on Gerald's terms. Weakened by the scandal and lacking social capital to fight back, Olivia accepted everything. Gerald kept the house, primary custody of Sophie with limited visitation for Olivia, and an asset division that recognized his financial contributions over the years while she built her career. Olivia's relationship with Charles didn't survive the scandal. He publicly blamed her for exposing the affair, calling it in interviews a misunderstood friendship and placing all responsibility on her. Patricia, meanwhile, made sure her divorce from Charles was as punitive as possible, using every legal resource available to her as an experienced prosecutor. Sophie, initially confused and hurt, gradually understood what had happened as she grew older. Gerald never spoke ill of Olivia in front of their daughter, but he also didn't lie when Sophie asked direct questions. The girl saw how her mother had less and less time for her, always busy trying to rebuild a reputation that would never be what it once was. She also saw how her father was always there, at school performances, games, tough teenage moments. The choice of who she preferred to be with became increasingly clear. 4 years had passed since that devastating night in the kitchen filled with flowers and champagne. Gerald had rebuilt his life steadily and deliberately. His consulting firm had grown significantly, he'd hired more staff and expanded into new markets. He'd become known in the community not just as a competent professional, but as a man of integrity who'd faced a personal crisis with dignity. He started dating again in the 3rd year after the divorce, carefully and without rushing. He met Rebecca, a high school literature teacher, through Sophie, who was in one of her classes. Rebecca was kind, genuine, with no grand political or social ambitions, just a woman who loved teaching and valued life's simple things. Their relationship blossomed naturally, and Sophie adored Rebecca from the start, seeing in her a maternal figure who truly cared. Sophie, now 16, was a bright and balanced teenager despite everything. She excelled in school, was captain of her volleyball team, and had a solid group of friends. Her visits with her mother had become increasingly infrequent and brief. Olivia tried to compensate with expensive gifts and empty promises, but Sophie was old enough to see through those attempts. The mother she'd known in childhood, the dedicated, ambitious woman who at least tried to balance career and family, had been replaced by someone bitter and distant, someone who clearly regretted her choices but was too proud to admit it. Olivia remained a judge, performing her duties competently but in isolation. She never fully escaped the shadow of the scandal. There was no chance of advancing to higher courts, no more invitations to the influential social circles she'd once craved. She lived alone in a modest apartment, very different from the life she'd imagined when planning her exit from the marriage. Charles had moved to another state after his own contentious divorce, cutting off all contact with her. The occasional messages she sent Gerald, blaming him for destroying her career, never received a reply. He'd moved on, and letting her live with the consequences of her own choices was the best form of closure. On a Saturday afternoon, 4 years and 3 months after that fateful night, Gerald was in the backyard helping Sophie plant yellow roses, her favorite. Rebecca was in the kitchen making lunch, and the house was filled with the sounds of a functional, happy family. Gerald's phone rang, an unknown number. He answered and heard Olivia's voice on the other end, hesitant and broken in a way he'd never heard before. She asked if Sophie was home, saying she'd tried calling their daughter but gotten no answer. Gerald called Sophie over, who looked at the phone, sighed, and reluctantly took the call. He watched his daughter walk inside, heard fragments of the conversation, Sophie's patient but distant voice responding in monosyllables. When Sophie returned to the garden a few minutes later, she simply shook her head and went back to planting roses, as if that call had been just another obligation fulfilled. Gerald looked at the house, at his daughter beside him, at Rebecca waving from the kitchen window. He thought about the journey he'd traveled since that devastating night, the sleepless nights, the pain he thought would never fade, the anger he'd had to process without letting it consume him. He thought of Olivia, alone and isolated, reaping exactly what she'd sown. There was no satisfaction in that thought, only a quiet acceptance that justice, however delayed and painful, had prevailed. Life wasn't perfect, he knew that. There were still scars, moments when Sophie clearly missed the mother she could have had, nights when Gerald wondered if he could have done something differently. But he'd built something solid from the wreckage, something real and true. He had a daughter who knew she could count on him unconditionally, a relationship based on honesty and mutual respect, a community that respected him, a thriving business, and above all, he'd regained his dignity and sense of justice. The yellow roses would bloom the following spring, filling the garden with color and life. And Gerald would be there to see it, beside the people who truly mattered, living the life he'd rebuilt with his own hands, a life no one could take from him because it was grounded in truth, integrity, and genuine love. Olivia had chosen prestige and ambition over family, and now she had tarnished prestige without the family to give it meaning. Gerald had chosen truth and dignity, and now he reaped the rewards of a well-lived life, surrounded by people who valued him not for what he could do for them, but simply for who he was. And on that sunny Saturday afternoon, with dirt on his hands and his heart finally at peace, Gerald understood that the best revenge was never about destroying the person who'd hurt him. It was about building a life so full and meaningful that the past became just a distant memory, a lesson learned on the path to something far better. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.